Leadership starts with unapologetic confidence, being grounded in who you are and what you stand for. In this episode with Kevin Britz, we explore how owning your strengths and values builds trust and a presence that truly resonates. It's the kind of confidence that inspires people to collaborate with enthusiasm. Welcome to Rise to Lead, the podcast where heart-driven leaders come together to inspire and innovate. They will share actionable tips and insights that help you lead your team more successfully, advance your career or business as a leader, achieve greater impact, and experience deeper fulfillment. I'm your host, Regina Huber, guiding you through deep conversations about leadership that's rooted in service, freedom, and the desire to leave a positive mark on the world. Are you ready to create real change in your leadership, your career, your life? Join me for a complimentary Lead and Thrive session, a 60-minute one-on-one strategy session where we will discuss your specific needs and map out the next steps to lead yourself and others powerfully. Spots are limited, so don't wait. Visit transformyourperformance.com/Lead Thrive session to book your Lead and Thrive session today. Let's work together to make it happen. Welcome to the Rise to Lead podcast. I am so delighted to introduce you to today's guest, Kevin Britz from Johannesburg, South Africa, the Life CEO. Kevin, welcome to Rise to Lead.
Thank you, Regina. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And I'm so curious about what you will share with us today. It's great having you. So let me quickly introduce you to our amazing listeners. I'm going to go on your website to read some of your wonderful, wonder-inspiring story. It's just like me, you seem to have quite eclectic background, which is always interesting to me. So you started out as an artist, right? A singer and songwriter. Then you discovered you turned that love for performance into a purpose that went far beyond music. And I love this, Kevin, because as you might remember, the name of my business is Transform Your Performance. And it came actually from that corner too, in a different way. We can talk about that later. So yeah, and that's how you learn to understand the true power of voice, influence, and connection, lessons that would ultimately lead you to empower others in discovering their own potential. You transition from the stage to the studio, and your career became that of one of South Africa's most sought after voice artists. That's amazing to hear. You were known as the voice of Steve by many, and I'm guessing that is related to some TV series.
It's actually a radio ad campaign that happened about 10 years ago, but still very, very famous in South Africa today, and actually relaunching with new brands. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'm not from there. I have spent some time in South Africa, but not enough to know this. And so your first major client was Nedbank, that I'm familiar with. And you created a presentation skills program for them. And through that work, you found your calling, helping others discover and harness their unique strengths and voices, both literally and metaphorically. So now in your current business, that's exactly what you do and beyond, right? We're going to talk more about this in just a bit. And I promise to add your bio to the synopsis for people to find out more about you. We'll definitely talk a lot about the word contagious, because today's show is about contagious identity, which has become sort of a trademark for you, right?
Yeah, it's a thank you for today, and thank you for this opportunity. It's contagious identity is the one liner, the slogan that I have for it is, where personal power meets transformation in people, teams, and organizations. And essentially, it's a deep-seated insight that we have about ourselves. And when we have the slightest taste and touch of what that insight is, we somehow transform. And I've done this specifically in my own life. And today, I have the opportunity to do that with so many corporates, so many teams. So yeah, it's now I've finally created an identity of what that is, and it
Okay,
really
great.
is based in personal power and transformation.
Awesome. I want to talk more about this, but before we do, tell us why you're passionate about what you do and what brought you here. We heard a little bit about your story, but I know there's so much more to it. So why don't we start with that?
I think part of the story is, it started way back when I was a little boy. I surprisingly discovered that I could sing, and it just happened that I was born with this talent. And I was probably a youngster at the age of 5, standing on a church bench listening to people sing. And I instinctively heard this, and I could harmonize with what they were doing on stage. And my mother turned to me and she looked and she said, "Where did you learn how to sing like that?" And I realized in that moment there was something I could do that wasn't familiar, and something I could do that nobody in my family anticipated. And from then, it sparked an idea and a thought and an identity within me, that has been gradually growing for a very long time. And obviously, with that, I moved to stage performance for large part of my life, and spent a lot of time in front of audiences singing, and that sort of moved into voice over work. And in between all that, I was very curious about humans and human behavior. So I done a whole bunch of certifications and learning about coaching, and why your brain does what your brain does, and essentially eventually found myself in a position where I was really wanting to help people. And one of my coaches one day said to me, "Well, Kevin, why don't you just teach people what you know?" And I was like, "I don't know. What do I know?" And he's like, "But you've spent your whole life on stage. You've been in front of people. You've sang. You've used your voice. Teach people how to use their voices." And I was like, okay. So I combined my know-how of a beautiful talent that I was born with, and this beautiful, structured, systematic approach to how coaching could help enhance and empower people. And with a combination of that, I shared that with Nedbank as my very first clients. And yeah, since then it's 10 years later and still going at it strong.
Wow, that's awesome. Yes. That sounds pretty amazing, I would say. I love to dance. I started taking singing lessons last year because it's something that I would like
Oh,
to do. Uh, the only thing is, the day only has 24 hours. And when this lady said she could no longer do it for personal reasons because she had some other urgencies and priorities coming up, I didn't restart, unfortunately. But it's awesome. Yeah, it's also liberating. I might not be the greatest singer like you. However, I thought it was interesting. It was a great experience, and I really wanted to do a little bit, something with my voice. I might pick
mm.
it up again though. And I also might pick percussion up again and some other stuff. For now, I
You
dance.
should you should do
I
it.
love, yeah, yeah. For now, dancing is still my priority. So yeah, I will definitely add something on again in the future soon. So that's why I personally can relate very much to this story, right? Because I love these activities, and I think a lot of other our listeners do as well. Now, when we go into coaching and into providing trainings, there are so many skills that people can bring to that, but we don't always think of those skills right away when we think about a coach, an executive coach, right? And that's what to me makes it so enriching for also for the coachees, because they can actually pick their favorite coach depending on their background. And that's what makes us all different and really gives us our identity. So let's talk a little bit more about this contagious identity that you mentioned earlier. You also wrote a book, right? The Future of Work is Human. Love the title. And you talk about contagious identity in the book too. So remind us again, or maybe expand a little bit more on what it means to you and why does it even matter for leaders?
So I think the important message that's connected to the whole reasoning behind the writing, the future of work is human, and then really establishing the identity of contagious identity is very often I found very much in a team setting, but also in an organization setting, that individuals very often feel disempowered, or they feel at the lack of being part of organizations and being able to add value. And what is beautiful about this process, because I've worked with organizations for some time now, specifically in a leadership capacity, you start realizing that when people have learned different modalities, different reason, different framing, different ideas of how they could step into their own power, they start realizing that we actually have more work, and we have more ability to get involved in creating the identity and empowerment that we'd like from experiencing in our lives. And very often, and that's what's beautiful about the work that I've done, is it started out very specifically in a training sense, and then it started connecting to how people are actually shifting their identity, shifting their own abilities, shifting their empowerment. And soon you start realizing that, okay, with a bit of work, with a bit of framing, with a bit of coaching, and a new insight and mindset, you actually have more power in your own hands than you think you do. And I think, as a general rule, I've noticed that because of beliefs, because of values, because of stories, because of our history, people tend to buy into what happened in the past, or what my mother said, or what my grandfather said, or you know connected to their past specifically, and they identify with that as absolute power, absolute wisdom, and absolute truth. And the moment you step into understanding more about you as an individual, your personal power, that's when things start shifting, and you challenge those beliefs, you challenge those values, and you start carving out this beautiful identity that actually becomes something that you're part of and you actively have part of, rather than just being at the mercy of someone or something, or something that was. And I think that's what the importance of this message and the connection that I have to it.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, of course. Yes, we're all imprinted by our culture, by our upbringing, the school system, all the different people in our lives that have an impact, right? That influence us, whether we want it or not. And
Yeah.
it's sometimes also a little bit challenging to break out of that, because of course a lot of this is subconscious, right? So what you have already alluded to is that by doing this work, people become more open to different perspectives, if I understood that correctly. Not just different perspectives potentially in themselves, but also around them as leaders, right? Because once we know ourselves better and see those different possibilities within ourselves, we can also more easily see them in other people. And I think that's also part of why I like the title of your book so much, The Future of Work is Human, because it's about the human being. A human being is a quite a complex being.
Yeah,
So, we could talk all day about what it even means just to be human, right? So
absolutely.
I'm curious also, why did you choose this and how did you discover this concept in your own leadership, whether it's your leadership of self, of others?
Yeah, so it's been an absolute journey for me, and that's why it's taken 10 years to get to this point where I know what it is. I know I can recognize it. I recognize it in other people, and we tend to recognize what contagious identity is often, but we don't know how to place it. So
Mhm.
very often we'll have an experience and an energy with someone in the same space as us, and we kind of go, wow, there's something about that person that is so contagious. It's like so, I just, when they're in the room, I feel better. They have this presence about them. They have this likability. But no one ever really understands or really investigates it to that degree. And growing up in a very big family, my mother would always, at one gathering, we would easily be 25 to 35 people in a room with everyone together. And my mother always made the comment that, no, we must wait for Kevin to get there. And I would get there and I'd say to my mom, why do you always need me to be there? Then she's like, yeah, but when you're here, it feels better. You make it better for everyone. And I was like, I wasn't doing anything consciously that I was aware of. But what I did start uncovering and understanding about the contagious identity I had was I made people feel comfortable. I was easily holding space for someone who was slightly awkward or someone who was really, over the top, or someone who was sitting in the corner. I brought everyone together. I made everyone feel really comfortable in their own skin. And sometimes even if I had to make a bit of fun of myself just to get people to laugh and really feel like they actually belonged in the same space. So I started really paying attention to what that was, and understanding who I am today. It comes down to, and it's a conversation we've had already, is around authenticity, and
Mhm.
and really understanding what authenticity is to you, and really understanding how you align with your authenticity. And, part of that authentic, tapping into that authenticity leads us to an unapologetic confidence. For me, it's a confidence that, it speaks just when you're present. You don't need to be loud. You don't need to be over the top. There's something that you carry that holds space completely effortlessly. Right. And the third one is, which very often I notice this when people lead with a bit of contagious identity, is their quiet authority. They step into a room, and there's just something that is a force to be reckoned with, and you feel that this person comes with a solid alignment of sorts. And it's not always very obvious, but it's definitely something. The more I've learned what I'm about, the more I've learned what people are about, and the more I've got to this discovery of what contagious identity is. Instead of like just saying, this is something I've made up. It's more of a discovery that I now realize, when you tap into it, when you do the work and you go through, really defining and aligning with your absolute purpose, it really falls into place. And it's very different for everyone, but it feels completely aligned. So, that's really how it's played out in leadership, but also in mind.
Yes, and you've touched on a lot of things. I even made some notes here because there were a lot of very interesting points that you mentioned here. I want to pick up a few of them, some just to really bring them into the focus again of our listeners, and some we can maybe expand on a little bit more. So, what you mentioned as this natural ability, this talent of yours to make people feel comfortable as a young person already. Well, I bring that also in the context of sensitivity and compassion, right? The way you described it.
Mm.
You say that also those are two important components of it.
Absolutely, and I think leading with an empathetic approach in every instance that you engage with people. And I think the reason why I do that, I instinctively do that, is because I've been in the position where people were not empathetic. I've been in the position where I was the least. I've been in the position where I was overlooked. And I was sitting in the corner and no one made the effort to pay attention to me. So I lead with empathy in every scenario, especially in a team setting, because there are such dynamics within teams, and when you realize somebody is not feeling as comfortable as what they should, or not really standing in their own power or speaking from a position of confidence. It's like, how do we then tap into and share and lead with empathy so that they feel a little bit more seen and a little bit more acknowledged, um,
Yeah.
compared to what they usually do.
Look, absolutely. So I very consciously and it doesn't contradict what you just said, talk about compassion rather than empathy, because I believe that empathy can also be very easily abused, you know, because it's just an ability of, okay, I feel what you feel, or I think to feel what you feel, and I can also abuse that. So that's why I personally prefer the word compassion in this context. But we do need the ability of empathy or sensitivity to really put ourselves in someone else's shoes, and then we can use it for we can use it with different intentions, so to speak, right? So to me, the
Yeah.
compassion is always like the empathy in action, in a way that we actually want to usually see it. Most of us want to see it in
Do you know,
leaders, right?
just to add to what you're saying, and I think that from a psychological perspective, and it's something, because I've been to so many psychologists in my life as well, and coaches, and
Mhm.
gone through so many modalities, it becomes abusive when we don't have emotional boundary, right? And essentially, you can be empathetic, but if you're not placing a boundary on how much you're engaged and how much you're willing to give, that's on you as an individual, right? So that emotional boundary is also as important to your contagious identity. It's not just about unending empathy and emotional connection, right? Because that's not healthy, right? So it
Yes.
really becomes a personal, boundaried approach to how you do you.
Absolutely. The way I meant it, so it can be abused in both directions. So you explained
Yeah.
the direction. I actually had meant in the other direction, but I'm glad you brought this up, because yes, it can be abused in a sense of, oh, this person is very empathetic, so I'm going to abuse of their ability, However, it can be abused in the other direction too. If I'm very empathetic,
Yeah.
I can, and I have a that it's really easy for me to feel what you feel. I can abuse of that. That's also what I mean sometimes, so to me, empathy, and it's a really interesting conversation, which I'm very grateful for, because it's become such a buzzword. So I want to make sure that
Yes.
it's really not all. Empathy is not always desirable. If it can be used
Mm.
against you, if somebody is very empathetic of you, they can, okay, I know what you feel, so I'm going to manipulate you with that knowing. So
Mm.
we really need to be careful. I'm a wordsmith a little bit, Kevin, just because I studied several different languages, and I know in South Africa you have
Yeah.
innumerable languages, so it's a very language rich country. So I think you can relate to it, right? And so sometimes I like to just pick the words apart a little bit, and I think that can be really helpful also as we use the words. So we went a little bit off on the sidetrack, but I think it's still very valuable, right? I hope you agree. but you
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
have
absolutely.
to.
Yeah, part of my background is neurolinguistics,
Yeah.
so absolutely, it's there has to be intentionality in everything
Yeah.
that we do, and and as you say, we as individuals, especially when you're really leading with a contagious identity, you have to understand, what is okay, when is someone taking advantage, when someone not taking advantage. It's absolutely okay to feel for people,
Mhm.
but you have to be aware of, when someone just taking, when is it just taking. So absolutely, there's a very strong position of the intentionality of how you phrase and how you share and how you choose to come across and share yourself, whether it be language or energy, the spaces we hold, how we conduct. Absolutely, a very necessary point.
Right. And we talked a lot about energy and authenticity in for your podcast in the episode, which I'm very grateful for. We had
Yeah.
a wonderful conversation. So thanks for that again. Um, so you talked about the quiet authority, and that to me also has to do with this, this alignment, in alignment with this energy that we talked about for your podcast. So maybe people want to check that out too. And we will be adding the podcast link to this episode as well. So what I really also liked is that you mentioned unapologetic confidence, right? To me, that is, in other words, it's okay to be me.
Yeah. And just to clarify, because it's so necessary to clarify on language, I
Mm-hmm.
think, unapologetically doesn't necessarily mean in your face. That's not the same.
Yeah.
Right. And I think people sometimes get that skewed because, they'll walk around and they'll say, well, this is who I am, like it or leave it. That's not what I mean, and that's not what I'm referring to. And so unapologetically confident is really honing what confidence is for you as an individual.
Yeah.
And I break it down into practical steps for people because, you know 15 years ago I struggled with confidence and no one could teach me how to cultivate confidence. And so I did the research and I learned how, and I started teaching people. And Albert Bandura, a psychologist that practiced way back, I think in the 80s, speaks about confidence broken down into two areas. And part of that is self-talk and self-efficacy, right? And when you suddenly look at what self-talk does, is very often we think we have confidence by being loud, and I'm making a generalization, absolutely. But sometimes we overspeak ourselves into a position, but we don't have the actual efficacy to substantiate the speaking part, right? But when we have the self-talk and we have the self-efficacy combined, and we cultivate that as a force to be reckoned with, it is far more confident, and it comes across far more confident. Whether you do that loudly or softly, essentially, it's unapologetic because I know what I'm talking about, and I believe what I'm talking about. And when I have those two things together, that's what makes a huge, massive impact to people's lives, especially dealing with their own confidence.
Yes, absolutely. So when I'm saying also it's okay to meet me, it's about it's okay to be expressing that, what you call identity,
Mm.
right? It's okay to say what I want to say, to express myself, to and of course to I want to go back also to what you said earlier. Yes, sometimes over talking actually signals the opposite of confidence. I do, like
Yes,
when
sometimes, yeah.
yeah, like when you do it in a job interview, for example, it could actually convey the idea that you're nervous, that you're not confident in that moment. So just a quick comment. So I want to go back to one other thing, because we've been talking about this contagious identity as something very beneficial so far, right? But contagion isn't always beneficial. Right? So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on, again, on how you see the language and how you choose to use it.
Yeah.
And essentially, when it's when and from me, and maybe it's my my choice to be the position I hold about my life and
Mhm.
what I do. It really comes from an absolute, genuine, positive, well-intended position, right? And like empathy, it could be intended negatively. It
Yeah, and I
depends on
just
the
want to say
position
real
we
quickly,
hold.
I did not mean you didn't. Right? I totally get, I just really want to make it clear. So I think you, to me, it makes a lot of sense. The term makes a lot of sense, contagious identity, right? It really spoke to me when you said you wanted to talk about this as a topic for today's podcast. I was very curious about it, and I want to probably put it in the title for this podcast. Now, I just really want to look a little bit at the other side of what that could also mean, and what I know you don't mean, but so that just
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
clarification. Mhm.
Yeah, and essentially for me, it's really tapping into what is the feel good thing that I can share with people on a genuine, ongoing basis. For me, it's the contagious identity in itself is really tapping into that feel good space for myself. And it's also an ongoing journey. So knowing, and especially when there's authenticity, confidence, and quiet authority that you're tapping into, part of that is also learning what's working and what's not working. Sometimes, in certain aspects, it might not be working, and you got to be honest and open and adult with yourself about that to kind of go, okay, maybe I tweak this and maybe I tweak that. And, that's why it's for me, it's an ongoing practice that we tap into, and really an awareness of your own courage for yourself, and how is this leading for you, and how are you going to be doing this. And there's and for I sharing this with people now is really saying, own in the skill of what it is for you, because um when there's alignment, it feels like flow. And flow in itself is a strange thing to unpack or even understand.
Mhm.
But until you're flowing and you're showing up with that type of presence for your life and for your work, for your family, for your relationships, there's alignment and it feels good, right? So I think that's where it becomes contagious. It's like, yes, I think this feels good for me and I like this feeling.
And I love that you said presence, because it is really the secret sauce for flow, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So when you're present with people, you are automatically, usually, unless you have a different intention, let's just say, but you come across as more authentic through your presence, because you have made the decision to really, be with that person now,
Mm.
right? And that
Yeah, absolutely.
and yes, and it can actually strengthen your own confidence, but it also increases the level of safety for the other person, usually.
Yeah, and I think that's also, it's probably part of why this message is so significant for me right now.
Mhm.
If we look at, some of the turmoil that we're experiencing in the world, some of the leadership decisions made in the world, you know, part of that presence is really, you're not numbing it out with noise or numbing it out with other things to fill a gap and fill a void. It's really quietening the noise of your mind and your life and
Mhm.
finding your signal. And I think that's such a nice kind of frame to think of it, is what is your signal, what is the frequency of your heartbeat, and how is that moving into the world. And through presence, that is, with quietening the noise, sometimes we try and avoid it because we don't want to sit down with ourselves and our thoughts and our identity. And sometimes we need to, until we have the courage to do that in that presence and that moment that you're having for yourself. um, we tend to miss the signal, right? And it's really honing that skill of what that signal is for you as an individual.
Yeah, I love that. And we could go into so many different directions in this conversation with you because this really resonates with me as well. You also mentioned the heart, so we could talk about that maybe in a future discussion. I literally just wrote an article earlier for a future LinkedIn submission, for my newsletter about listening with your heart. So it comes into this it has to do with that context too. But I have another question for you right now. So how do you marry being contagious with adapting to different environments or teams?
I think that's part of the contagious identity, right? Because what we know, and I suppose I'm in a prime position to know this well because I have to adapt to teams and environments all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And part of, one of the presuppositions that we learn in coaching is the person with the most flexibility and of choices and behavior rules the system. And when you really unpack that and you really absolutely understand what that means, any circumstance, any moment, any experience that you're having in real time, there's a split second, a fraction of a second where you have an opportunity to either freak out about something or choose a different approach. And it's in that choices and behavior, because I'm, in this environment where I'm constantly catching myself going, okay, so if I'm in charge of what's happening in this moment, how flexible is my choices and my behavior? And sometimes, I'm human. My choices and behavior are just not flexible. And I'm like, okay, so now I'm, at the lack of something, and I got it wrong. But
Yeah,
because I
being
do this
human
so
is not a
often, and
bad
because
thing.
I no, and that's the beauty of it. It's like that's why it's a journey of exploration. And I think, that's the important part of it is learning the flexibility and the agility of what we do have as humans. And we tend to sometimes dismiss it, or we don't recognize it because we rather are reactive than responsive. And I think right there is a key position to hold is, are you being reactive or are you being responsive? Which one is it? And, sometimes, a response is a necessary one, and it might come across as quite vocal and quite energetic, or even angry. But sometimes it's necessary to have that response, right? So it's really gauging your ability on what your choices and behaviors are, and then leading and kind of going, do I rule my system? Am I in charge of my system, my day, my relationships, my family, my business, how you conduct you? And I think that's where the secret sauce is.
All right. So what's then one practical way that leaders can tap into their contagious identity today? What would you say?
I think one of the very first things that I always, and I learned this the hard way, unfortunately, but psychologists call this radical acceptance. And for me, it's radical self-acceptance. When you really radically engage with you to that degree and kind of go, it is what it is, and it isn't anything else other than it is. When you really step into, I am me, and have that absolute radical acceptance of, this is where we start. That is a very good first step to tapping into what the contagious identity is, because very often when we are not accepting of the very vessel that we're in, the very body that we find ourselves in, we're still in denial, and we almost, well, this is the identity I choose to be, and I'm almost disconnected from the very person I am. And to me, it's kind of going, well, have you radically accepted who you are? And when you really have a sentiment and an essence of that is, it feels kind of like, it feels like relief. That's how I often hear people explain and resonate with that. It feels like, okay, I think I've got this. I think I'm okay with me. And yeah, it takes work. It takes, the presence, but radical acceptance, step one.
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to what we said earlier. It's okay to be me. It's okay to be who I am.
Yeah,
Yes, and it has to do with that also, that very important role of self-awareness in leadership, right? So there is no self-leadership without self-awareness, and there's no sustainably effective leadership without self-leadership. And that,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, that has so that identity that you have been talking about has an important role in this self-awareness, and in this self-leadership. Of course, it's a central piece of it, right? I'm
Yeah.
curious how that also comes, how that is described in your book. Tell us a little bit more about that book.
So I think the book is sort of a precursor to the Contagious Identity, and it speaks about the work and industry neutral growth skills. And this sort of occurred when I first saw, COVID happened, people changed,
Yeah, the
corporations
lockdown
changed
happened.
from so much happened, right? And it almost like really challenged the very values that we've based, business on in the last 50 years. And suddenly this has happened, and we all have to make these big different decisions. And for me, it's, human behavior. If you see someone changing, and we didn't do this in a small capacity, we did this as a whole planet, where we suddenly went from engaging to not engaging. And as humans, we don't generally do that. That's, and especially not as a planet. So the question was, what does that mean, and what does that mean for the future of work? So I started investigating and came across some studies around, um, what are the skills that we need for the future of work. And one of the professors that I came across speaks is Professor Walter van der Velde, speaks about the work and industry neutral growth skills and the publications that were, being publicized all over the world, and the commonalities that we find in human behavior. And the 5 commonalities that we find in human behavior is creativity, critical thinking, social intelligence, self-management, and attention management. And when you learn these 5 skills, those 5 skills can help solve any challenge you have in business. And when you see, okay, so all of these skills are, publicized all over the world and in so many publications, but the 5 core primary skills that are actually showcased very often the most are these 5 primary skills in humans. And it's a human thing that's being spoken about. So you kind of go, okay, so what does that mean for the future of work? And that's what the book is really about.
Yeah, I just want to pick up a few ideas, because I mean, you mentioned critical thinking, and there was literally no critical thinking of most people at that time, if I were just gonna
Yeah.
very clearly. So some of us did refuse to not engage anymore, right? We did not play the game, and it's also a whole other conversation about how easy it is to manipulate huge masses of people. Now, because it wasn't as sudden as it seemed to most people how this happened, so to speak, in quotation marks. But so there's a big conversation around that, of course, that would be possible as well, maybe some other time. Now, I just really, so I just really wanna go back a little bit to another piece that we touched on earlier as well. And so when you have someone in a team, for example, that is very contagious, even also, in a what you think might be a great way, what do you do as a leader of that team to make sure that other people get a chance to be heard as well?
I think, very often when people do have a bit of an energy in a room, it's always significant to be able to observe into that space and kind of go, so what is the dynamic? And sometimes, some people are quiet because they prefer to be quiet. So it's really understanding what the dynamics are at play, and from someone who works with teams very often. with the engagement, it's always tapping into, okay, so what does that look like for the quiet person, and what does that look like for the louder person in the room? And essentially, very often creating psychological safety in a space like that, and really getting people to engage to a degree where they don't generally get to know each other. So very often I would help people have a bit of an uncomfortable conversation, and match them up differently, so that they start learning how, what are those essence that we carry within a team dynamic. And 9 times out of 10, people find commonalities far more when they're just sitting down, in a one-on-one conversation than they anticipate. And I think engaging at a human level is a very good, strong start for understanding the dynamics, especially in teams when people are sometimes louder or quieter. It's like, let's take them out of like it's us against them kind of a position, and really put them together to really have a solid human to human conversation. And suddenly when that happens, dynamics change quickly.
Right. Yes, it's all about humanizing the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely.
More, yes, respecting the human in the workplace and also making it more humane, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. So, where can people find your book? I'm assuming it's on Amazon.
Yes, so if they can head over to Amazon, and The Future of Work is Human, and it's Kevin Britz. And yeah, it's available everywhere globally.
Yeah. So I'm going to take this opportunity and do a little self-promotion here to all listeners.
Absolutely.
Also on Amazon for all listeners who want to lead themselves and their lives in a way that gives them greater satisfaction and fulfillment. Remember to check out my book, Living My Freaking Amazing Life, as well. So yes, it is about creating the life that's perfect for you anywhere in the world. It's a book for leaders who want to thrive in their leadership of themselves, their lives, and of others. And yeah, check it out on Amazon. Check out both books on Amazon. And I look forward to hearing from you what you think about the books. And I think you will love both. So back to you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience today? Any wisdom that I haven't asked you about?
I think, my final message for today is I really think that, personal power, and I think that's, we started there, personal power, where personal power meets transformation. And I think, if you want to, and this, because, you teach people this personally, but it really starts, the transformation of organizations, businesses, lives, relationships, and inevitably your vision for your life. Tap into your personal power, because when you do, you might be astounded to what it is you find out.
Yeah, I love this. I sometimes call it to connect the inner power cord.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly that.
Yeah, we're aligned in that for sure. So just before we call it a wrap, where can people find you? No need to mention all the links. We're going to put them all in the episode description, but I would love to share where people can find your podcast and maybe.
Yeah, I think the best place would be to go and check out my website, kevinbritz.com. Everything is there. My whole life is there, and everything from the lunchtime series, which is the podcast, all the way to the book, to all the voiceover that I do. And yeah, so everything is there at kevinbritz.com. And yeah, if you want to chat to me, please let me know, and we'll connect.
Awesome. Everything in one place, kevinbritz.com. And with that, it's a wrap. Thanks to everyone for listening. Stay tuned for next week when I'll be here again with yet another amazing guest. And thank you, Kevin, for joining us today.
Thanks, Regina. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to Rise to Lead. Keep shining your light, standing up for what's right, and inspiring others to step into their brilliance. If you like this episode, please give it a 5-star rating and subscribe to the Rise to Lead podcast on your preferred podcast app. Until next time, it's Regina Huber. And in the meantime, remember to rise to lead.